So, welcome to the second Madingley Lecture. The Madingley Lectures are the University's Institute of Continuing Education's new public lecture series here at Madingley Hall. I am Rebecca Lingwood, the Director of Continuing Education, and I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our lecturer this afternoon, Dr. Francis Warner. Francis Warner has many talents. He is a poet, a dramatist, and an academic, and is now an Emeritus Fellow of St. Peter's College, Oxford. Francis was born in Yorkshire, but spent the years of the Second World War in Epsom, Surrey, where his father was a parish priest. Francis was educated at Christ's Hospital and won a choral scholarship to St. Catharine's College, Cambridge, where he is now an Honorary Fellow. Francis began his academic career in Cambridge as staff tutor in English at the Board of Extramural Studies, which is one of the many former titles of the Institute of Continuing Education. So, welcome home, Francis. Francis then moved to Oxford in 1965, where he stayed for 34 years, becoming a central figure in the English faculty and in college and university life. At various times, he was Vice Master of St. Peter's and Pro-Proctor of the university, and he was awarded the Oxford Doctor of Letters in 2002. Francis is also a distinguished poet, playwright, and composer. His collected poems appeared in 1985, and he is the author of 16 plays. As a composer and librettist, he works closely with David Good, from whom I'm very pleased to say we have a recital later this afternoon. Recent anthems from the Warner-Good collaboration have been performed here in Cambridge by King's College Choir and the Choir of St. Catharine's, among others. A full account of Francis's career and a celebration of his affection for Cambridge and for Madingley Hall can be found in his two autobiographical poems, By the Cam and the Isis, 1954 to 2000. Our lecture today, Armageddon and Faith, a survivor's meditation on the Blitz, 1940 to 1945, will last approximately 75 minutes, with questions taken at the end of the lecture, which will then take us to tea at about 4:30. I just want to remind you, before I hand over to Francis, that if you have your mobile phones with you, now is the time to switch them off. Thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. Francis Warner.
If you stand on Epsom Downs, near the racecourse, in the meadow behind the grandstand, and look north, you will see below you Epsom as the start of a conurbation that reaches right up to London's Wembley Stadium, easily recognised from this vantage point today by its huge arch. With the exception of this arch, this is how the Nazi bombers, flying in across the Channel, saw London, marking especially the Leatherhead railway line that, as it comes into Epsom, divides into two rail arteries, supplying Clapham Junction, London's Victoria and Waterloo stations. Epsom, then, was their first and particularly their last target. If raiders were still carrying bombs as they turned for home, they would jettison them over Sutton, Ewell, and finally Epsom, as they saw the green countryside of the Downs approaching. This air corridor was known as Bomb Alley. The sky above Epsom Downs, therefore, was where the British single-seater Spitfires and Hurricanes defending London would try over open ground to intercept the Nazi bombers. The two-seater Junkers dive bombers, the Heinkel Drei K Mark Funts, the Dornier 200 Funtseins, each with their four-man crews and their three mobile machine guns. The Spitfires and the Hurricanes were faster and more manoeuvrable than these, but they had to contend with fighter escorts flying above the bombers, one- and two-seater Messerschmitts, which were as swift as the British planes and could have up to 6 machine guns as well as a cannon firing through the air screw hub. The Battle of Britain lasted from the 10th of July to the 31st of October, 1940. And my 3rd birthday fell during that October. For the next 5 formative years of my childhood, I experienced at immediate hand my country fighting all-out war. Through most of our first decade, my brothers and I knew nothing else. Every day was dominated by it. Every night was pitch black, and for long stretches of time, exhaustingly interrupted. Throughout that astonishingly beautiful summer and autumn, and indeed daily from the 8th of August until the 31st of October, the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe could be seen by everyone, spiralling above us, killing each other. In addition, overlapping, from the 7th of September began the night Blitz, concentrated on London for 57 consecutive sunsets, until the all-clear sounded at 4 or 5 in the morning. Thereafter, frequent heavy bombing continued all winter and spring until the following May. The Blitz then became intermittent as other cities were bombed, with the onslaught on London intensifying in January 1943. Worse was that of January 1944. Then came the arrival of the Doodlebugs, or V-1 rockets, which were followed by the huge and terrifying V-2 rockets, against which there was no defence. That was during the last 11 months of the war. But in no year was Epsom spared being strafed and bombed. Perhaps the War Office statistics may evoke the ferocity, if not the experience, of 5 years of blitzkrieg focused on the little Surrey town of Epsom, with the next town, Ashtead, 2 miles away to the southwest, and Ewell, 1.5 miles to the northeast. Epsom, this sitting target at the foot of the Downs, that tried so hard to shield our wild cradling and uncertain childhood. 192 houses annihilated. 413 houses rendered uninhabitable. 12,234 houses damaged, including both our vicarages in which we lived. approximately 440 high-explosive bombs dropped on Epsom, in addition to many thousands of incendiary bombs and many thousands of personnel or butterfly bombs, all raining down on 4 square miles. At the crest of the Downs, as you leave the racecourse and start to walk downhill from the meadow along Downs Road, you come to Epsom Cemetery. In that peaceful setting is a neat set of war graves holding 11 of those young men who gave their lives defending us. Each of them was buried by my father, who was vicar of Epsom. And there, as he wished, with my mother, he lies buried with them. With 4 of his sons under 9 in 1940, and 2 brothers on active service, he cared deeply for the school leavers and the young men in their early 20s fighting in the sky, at sea like his own brothers, and on land. He sensed their loneliness as they waited, asked his parishioners to open their houses to them, and he created a free in and out club by Epsom's central clock tower for the troops. He was also officiating chaplain to the armed forces. Vulnerable, many far from home, Canadians, Poles, as the war ground on from all over the Commonwealth. Much later, the United States. By the eve of D-Day, thousands had used this meeting place gratefully, as their letters testify. The town so seethed with khaki-dressed forces personnel that we children were unable to push our way through the middle of the road. Suddenly, all were gone. That Tuesday morning, the headmistress told us to go home because 65 miles south, the invasion of France had begun, and our soldiers were fighting their way up the beaches. By now, of course, we knew a number of them. Her simple words burned into our brains. We left, spending the rest of the day by the wireless. That was the 6th of June, 1944, the beginning of the last year of the war, full Armageddon, 4 long years after the Battle of Britain in 1940. But to return to that battle. As you leave the cemetery and turn downhill, the road eventually becomes Church Street, where Epsom's parish church, St. Martin's, a powerful and defiant architectural statement in flint, completed in 1908, towers. Down the flight of steps from the west door and across the parade ground can be seen the old King's Head pub, 26 Church Street, and a few buildings further down along is number 18. The beautiful, large Queen Anne vicarage with substantial garden behind, where, until we were bombed out, I was brought up. Goering was under criticism for the continual loss of his raiding aircraft, and he began a massive thrust to break the RAF, arriving at midday on the 27th of September, 1940. Lasting through the night and on for 4 days. In this many-windowed brick house, during this, one of the heaviest bombing raids of the war, with over 1,000 enemy aircraft stacked 4 miles into the sky above us, while we tried through unimaginable noise to sleep in the reinforced cellar underneath. That, in the shuttered and candlelit dining room above us, on a mattress on the floor, so she could roll under the table if the house went down, without painkillers, my mother gave birth to my younger brother. Puzzled by her sleeping arrangements, I'd asked her, "Will you be all right, Mummy?" as we went down to the cellar, not understanding that she was facing the most terrifying experience of her or any woman's life. "Yes, darling, I'll be all right. God bless you," she said quietly. As was appropriate, her Blitz baby was named Martin, after the patron saint of our church, and Michael, as this was now Michaelmastide, and there was, in all truth, war in heaven. In the garden of the old vicarage was a fecund and spreading mulberry tree, still there today. We enjoyed its fruit, but more important to us boys were its leaves, which we fed to our silkworms. David, my eldest brother, was adept at spinning off their gold silk. He was in charge of all 4 of us and never showed the slightest fear, however menacing destruction around us. We looked up to him, so were blithely confident all would be well. Our cause was self-evidently right, and the British always won. But in case Hitler attacked our rocking horse, our only expensive toy, David called a council of war on the garden steps to the cellar. He proposed that we find brushes, green paint, and also some mulberry colour to dab spots on the green as it was summer, and together we painted the rocking horse as it rocked. It never occurred to us to put a brick under the rocker. Now camouflaged, it was dragged by us under the mulberry leaves so that if the house fell, we should still have our toy. We'd seen Mother burying some of the family silver in the garden. And with luck, Nazi pilots might not catch sight of it thanks to our ingenuity. Annie, our elderly maid who lived with us, died. As the months went by, it became clear that this unwieldy house was more than Mother could manage. With the new baby, unremittingly broken nights, the never-assuaged need to feed 5 hungry males, and, of course, the claims on a vicar's wife of sorrow and danger throughout the parish, the pressures began to tell on her health. When an incendiary bomb missed our church but wiped out the buildings on the other side of the old King's Head pub, it was time to move. All our windows were blown out. Rubble, hot shrapnel, and grief were on our doorstep, and ash mottled everything. In addition, nature, having overlooked to supply mankind with a means of side-head sneezing, we brothers had to blow the all-pervading white powdered dust out of each other's ears before pillow time. So we moved to safety, 1 street away, number 13 Warple Road, just beyond the little school, Miss Chadban's Salcombe House, where I went in the mornings to learn my alphabet in a cellar full of pit props holding up the ceiling, just in case. This was a necessary precaution. In 1942, during my first term, Petworth Boys' School, 26 miles southwest, was bombed in a daylight raid, killing the headmaster and 31 others, boys and staff. A stick of 8 bombs aimed at Epsom's convent school on the Dorking Road, causing devastation, just missed the school. But during my second term, on the 20th of January, 1943, in Catford, 12 miles away, northeast, on that same Cherbourg to London radio beam flight path over it as Petworth, Epsom, Catford, Sandhurst Road School was deliberately targeted, according to eyewitnesses, by a low-flying aircraft with machine gun and bomb, leaving 38 children aged from 5 to 15 and 6 members of staff laid out dead on the playground. From these facts, we schoolchildren, however young, could not possibly be shielded, nor would we forget. Even today, at Christmastide, when I hear, read from the lectern, of Herod's massacre of the innocents, in Ramah was there a voice heard, lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children and would not be comforted because they are not. My mind goes back to those school deaths, each side of me, in my first 2 terms at school, and now to those young bones in their mass graves. Our vicarage was by the bowling green, a well-built, the new vicarage that is, well-built 2-storied house with a bay window each side the front door. There are photographs outside. One day I walked home from Salcombe House School, past the bowling green to our new home, and as there was nobody in, and it was a perfect day, I went to the garden and sat in the apple tree. High above came a speck, streaking into this vast, neck-wrenching expanse of blue, a sun-gleamed diamond slitting open the airmail summer sky, to leave in its track a narrow line of milk that spread, dispersed, and faded into alto stratus cloud. Coming in at an angle from over the racecourse on Epsom Downs, flashed another. As it approached the first, I could hear, above the distant drone of their engines, a new sound, like the cigarette card I had wedged into the spokes of my cycle to make it clatter like a motorbike. The 2 streaks of milk crossed, curdled, and continued on their way, making a giant kiss across heaven, until the first began to arch into a white rainbow, to corkscrew, then disappear, shedding a flimsy mushroom suspended in the sky, dangling a kicking man. By this stage, I had seen many a dogfight above us swirling around. One could not miss them, but this was the first one I had watched alone. At that moment, something in my childhood understanding grew up. My mother's sister, my Aunt Rabine, now came to live with us, bringing their mother, my grandmother. Rabine took a teaching job at the Orchard School on the other side of town, where I joined my brothers. She escorted us there each day through Rosebery Park, the youngest keeping up on a scooter. She wrote in a little notebook of this time, "I was in Epsom when a German plane turned up and began to machine gun the road. We, the pedestrians, ran to the nearest house and were amused to be assured by a voice with a strong American accent, "You're safe here. This is neutral ground. It is an annex of the embassy in London." Sometimes we had to dive into the air raid shelters in the park on our way to and fro. But on the whole, daylight raids were few and quite short. But, she goes on, for a long time we had nightly air raids. There were some exciting nights as we were in Bomb Alley. However, the Germans were so punctual that you could set your watch by them, which was a great help in organising bedtime. And there, with self-effacing humour and understatement, she closes the door. What I can add is what it felt like in our second vicarage after bedtime. Upstairs at the tape-crossed window, armed with our aircraft recognition book, peeping with my brothers through the blackout at the moon on the barrage balloons as they swayed like bloated, drunken dolphins. The banshee wailing of the siren bomber alerts, rising and falling, up and down. The odd lack of any other noise at all. Then, the throb of bombers overhead. Hundreds of them. And that feeling of, that surge of relief as our Spitfires and Hurricanes arrived. We knew their distinctive sound when we could hear them. The distant double boom of the anti-aircraft guns. The night skies scissored by sharp-edged probing beams of searchlights. On one occasion, watching with heart-stopping clarity, a Junkers 87 riding down the searchlight beam to dive bomb artillery, and our debate over which had won. The inevitable knock at the door, and a voice telling us to get away from the window, dress quickly, and come down to the Anderson shelter or hide under the stairs. As the Anderson shelter was at the end of the garden among the trees, we used it sparingly. But when we did, we absorbed with the night air on our cheeks a sky deafeningly full as far as the eye could see. Close to us, dull red glow of cigarettes pricked the darkness by the bowling green. As the fire watchers in their round black tin hats trod over the rubble, marking craters, warning, going about their work. Our lives and our nation were under threat. That awareness never left us, but we lived with it, as children do, with a stoic calm, assuming it was normal. Colin Perry, who was a little older than us, 18, caught our outlook and responses well. 10th of July, 1940. Tonight is said to be the night for the German invasion. England today reminds me of David, Germany and her conquered lands of Goliath. It came to me as I visualized over a map that I was a watcher miles above the earth viewing the German invasion of this country. Britain seemed so tiny, so forlorn, that as I saw the waves of aircraft, the mass of shipping converging upon her shores from so vast an enemy territory, I could see nothing which could prevent the success of that invasion. The British were rushing hither and thither, bombed here, bombed there. The British air fleet seemed so puny as it attempted to destroy and wreak retaliation on the enemy. I could see absolutely nothing which could stem the sadistic, degenerate, all-destroying Nazi war machine as it descended upon these green, peace-loving shores. It was then that I remembered. David slew Goliath, and God was in his heaven, and I no longer feared. Indeed, I lifted up my heart and thanked God. I was privileged to live in such momentous times. At any moment now, as I write this, the attack may commence. We are awaiting with calm fortitude for the inevitable. Air raids, massed murder, total devastation of beautiful buildings, the unknown, and gas too, maybe, to poison our food and pollute our water. We have witnessed countries torn to shreds by this Moloch of our age. We, alone now, await his onslaught, calm, confident, determined. Despite all this, it's not the war that occupies the whole of my inner mind, but the girl in the ABC cafe. She smiled at me over the waitress's shoulder today. I hope she has a pleasant voice. Well, beside Colin Perry speaking for us who are children, we must set the words of Churchill a week later, on the 18th of June 1940, broadcasting to all and each of us on the wireless. What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into an abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. Churchill's great speech crystallized and defined our approach to the ordeal. What were the feelings of those only a year or two older than Colin Perry, answering Churchill's call and doing their duty in the air? Here is David Crook of 609 Squadron, high above us on the 27th of November, during the very hours my brother Martin was struggling to come into our darkened, candlelit world. Soon we saw a squadron of Messerschmitts, Hundertzehn's, circling over Swanage at 25,000 feet, waiting to protect their bombers on their return. We immediately turned toward the enemy fighters and started to climb above them. Generally, we were outnumbered by anything from 3 to 1 to up to 10 to 1. But on this glorious occasion, there were 15 of them and 12 of us, and we made the most of it. We were close to them now, and we started to dive. I think that these moments, just before the clash, are the most gloriously exciting moments of life. You sit there behind a great engine that seems as vibrant and alive as you are yourself. Your thumb waits expectantly on the trigger, and your eyes watch the gun sights through which, in a few seconds, an enemy will be flying in a veritable ball of fire. All around you, in front and behind, there are your friends too, all eager and excited, all thundering down together into the attack. The memory of such moments, to us everything seemed heightened. On Sunday morning, the collect for morning service felt as though it had been written for us that dawn. O God, who art the author of peace and lover of concord, Defend us, thy humble servants, in all assaults of our enemies. Not from them, but in them. Defend thus thy humble servants in all assaults of our enemies, that we, surely trusting in thy defence, may not fear the power of any adversaries. Even the daily psalms spoke on our behalf. Mine enemies are daily in hand to swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me, O thou most highest. Nevertheless, though I am sometime afraid, yet put I my trust in thee. Even pilots could be sometime afraid. Here at Madingley, we remember the American dead in their beautiful cemetery on our hill. Raymond W. Wild was a B-17 pilot with a 92nd Bomb Group H, stationed down the road at Poddington, Northamptonshire, 3 years later, in the autumn of 1943. He said, "There isn't anybody wants to get killed. You think, oh boy, I'm not going on this. This'll kill me." And then you'd say, well, what I'll do is, I'll wait a while, and then I'll go on sick call and get out of it. Then you go down to the airplane and you'd see her, and well, I'll go on sick call later. And then you'd see everybody getting their planes, and you'd know they were just as frightened as you were. And you'd think, well, what the hell? I'll go about 100 miles, and I'll find something wrong with this airplane. But they had this tradition that an 8th Air Force sortie never turned back from its target. So in the end, you didn't dare turn back. Pride made you go. This is far from the Battle of Britain public school ethos, in which from an early age, in my case from 8, we were toughened. And we have just seen exemplified in David Crook experiencing the most gloriously exciting moments of life. But we must remember the bomber pilots, if shot down, did not fall into an English village. Here is Churchill again, 2 months after that speech I've just read to you. He spoke this on the 20th of August, 1940. The great air battle, which has been in progress over this island for the last few weeks, has recently attained a high intensity. All hearts go out to the fighter pilots, whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes, day after day. But we must never forget that all the time, night after night, month after month, our bomber squadrons travel far into Germany, find their targets, often under the heaviest fire, often with serious loss, with deliberate, careful discrimination, and inflict shattering blows upon the whole of the technical and war-making structure of Nazi power. There was one bomber pilot I knew and loved. His name was John Hugh Davis, co-pilot of a somewhat primitive Armstrong Whitworth Whitley. He was just 22 when, on his second sortie over Germany, he was shot down, caught in a firewall of flak. Flames began to spread through his aircraft as it faltered into its descent. The 19-year-old pilot beside John, at the controls, on reaching for his parachute from the hook behind him and finding it missing, panicked. "Don't worry, take mine," said John. Helped him into it and out of the plane. It was now high time for John to jump. So he picked up the fallen parachute, put it on, and it just had time to open before he hit the tree. That was the 15th of September, 1941. For 3 years, 8 months, John was a prisoner of war in the Nazi camps, enduring all the deprivations and long marches we find so hard to imagine. One morning he woke up and found all the guards had gone. About half the camp's prisoners had once left for the woods. He and others remained to see what would happen. All who left were killed. The Allies liberated those who remained 2 days later. And he arrived home for debriefing on the 11th of May, 1945. His medals, which he never applied for, have just arrived and are here in the keeping of his only child, Penelope, whom I married. John's granddaughter, Miranda, is in New Zealand, but here is his grandson, Benedict, who himself has just had his 23rd birthday. What we learned at the vicarage was the meaning and consequences of some deaths. My father spoke little of his nightly visits to the burning, bombed and dying, the moments of bereavement, his cleaning, for instance, of a husband's brains blown out by shrapnel from the wall of his distraught wife's, or rather widow's, living room. Our parents protected us from these. I only learned of that when I read his biography. But in total war, even the youngest will have to face the fact of sudden and shocking death soon, sometimes in oblique ways. My mother asked the 4 of us boys to stay in this afternoon because the children of a friend of our parents, boys we knew well, were coming round at short notice. Please would we play a long game of Monopoly with them, keep cheerful, and do not ask questions. We knew their father had recently been reported killed on active service, so we were only too glad to help in this way, but that was not it. Their eldest brother, Colin, had become a prefect at Epsom College. The death of his father had hit him hard, and he was cautioned by the headmaster about his recent behaviour. Colin's mother had spoken to him to say he must grow up, take responsibilities of the eldest man now in the family, and cause no more complaints from the school. Colin had tried, but once more tripped on some behavioural issue. Been called to the headmaster's study and stripped of his prefectship. He had left that study, gone straight home this morning, climbed up into the loft, and with his chemistry set, killed himself. This was near the end of that long, bitter war. I had encountered my first moral crisis earlier when working just outside our vicarage in my short trousers, doing my bit for the war effort, preparing for the coming invasion, I was trying to lasso with a noose of cotton a fat bumblebee. My hope was that as I held the other end of the cotton, the bee would fly above my hand like a barrage balloon. So when the Nazis arrived outside our house, I should have an effective weapon. Better still, if I could have a fleet of these bumblebees buzzing in an attacking ball. Workmen were filling in holes in Warple Road. One, older, with a war wound and looking ill, dug slightly apart. He saw me at my front door and made a gesture showing he was thirsty. I went in, filled a brown tin mug with water, and took it out to him. He drank quickly, then he smiled his thanks, and putting a red plastic disc in the mug for me, handed it back. But he never spoke. I assumed it was one of those red discs we used at the nearest British restaurant for cheap off-ration meals. But when I looked at it in my bedroom, to my horror, it carried the hated swastika. You can see it. I have it here. The road worker, it dawned on me, must have been a Nazi prisoner of war. Guilt engulfed me. I had carried Hitler's triumph sign into our home, betrayed our country in its hour of need. I was evil. And yet was I? War was not as straightforward as I thought. I hid it in my metal badges box for 70 years and told no one until today. Or rather, yesterday. Preparing for this lecture, I asked a colleague over lunch what he thought it was. The swastika at the bottom is self-evident. Above it are the words Gau Ost Hanover. Gau, he told me, is an old German word revived by the mythologizing Nazis, and here meaning administrative district. So the words translate as administrative district of East Hanover. Above this, in the large capitals of the old German script style, are 3 letters, NSV. These, he revealed, stand for National Sozialistische Volkswohlfahrt, which means National Socialist, or Nazi, People's Welfare. Donors, when the Nazis came round with their collecting boxes, were given a small souvenir gratitude gift of negligible value, but the more generous donors were presented with a disc like this, which could be worn as a lapel badge. And what was the National Socialist Welfare Programme, to which this raiding machine gunner, he was too old to be a pilot, this wounded and thirsty prisoner of war, had been so generous a donor? One that ran children's homes, provided assistance to pregnant mothers and so on. That small boy with his brown tin mug is still morally puzzled 70 years later. How, you may ask, did the young do their courting under such circumstances? I will show you, with an example rather more successful than that of Colin Perry and his unaware girl in the ABC cafe. Henry Chadwick, who was reading music at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and soon to embark on his 3rd year, had met Margaret Brownrigg, also a musician, at a Sunday tea party at St Paul's Vicarage. Bedford College, London, where she was studying, had been evacuated to Newnham College, Cambridge. Henry was smitten. He invited her to a promenade concert at the Queen's Hall, London, to hear Moisevich playing a piano concerto on the 7th of September, 1940. As this was the vacation, September, Peggy and her brother Stuart boarded their train from Wimbledon, but on the way into central London, the sirens sounded. Raiding bombers were flying overhead in a steady stream. So the train stopped for 20 minutes, and all the passengers lay on the floor to avoid bomb blast and glass. During the prom, the siren sounded from 5 until 7 p.m, and then from 8 p.m. until 5 a.m. in the morning, when the weary audience emerged to see the dawn sky lit up as the London docks were ablaze. Moisevich had entertained the audience into the small hours by improvising with the orchestra a toy symphony after the example of Haydn's, in which those lying on the floor could participate. Here is Henry's letter, written a few hours later. Somewhere in High Wycombe, 8th of September, 1940. My dear Peggy, I'm so glad you got home safely last night, even though it was such a business. I was possibly rather a fool to leave cover and walk down to Piccadilly Circus during the raid, as that part was bombed a bit. Actually, I was very envious of you sleeping in the Queen's Hall, as the noise was terrific, and I did not get to sleep till well after the all clear. There was one particular bomb, which I heard whining as it fell. It must have been 1/4 of a mile. Actually, for a moment, I imagined it was the end. Thanks so much for coming to the concert with me. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to the music, but it was made even more so by having you and Stuart, or does he spell it Stuart, to enjoy it with. I hope to go again on Wednesday night, to the Brahms concert, if the hall still stands. The hall was destroyed by a direct hit, an incendiary bomb through the roof, only a month or two later. If you can take it, do come up again. I believe a lot of our camp officers are coming too, as Donald Cretan, etc. My sister and I arrived here, that's High Wycombe, at 5 p.m. The place is packed out with people who found last night's raid too hot. And it was 10 p.m. before we were fixed up with bed and breakfast. However, all's well that ends well, and I am now sitting on my bed deciding that 12 hours sleep might just about see me through. A little folding of the hands. Yours I, Henry. Henry Chadwick was indeed successful, and Lady Chadwick is with us here this afternoon with their 3 daughters. With these introductory thoughts in your minds, I should now like to take you back to the beginning of my and my family's particular witness to these events. To 1936, 3 years before the outbreak of World War II, the year before I was born. In my Aunt Rabine's tiny notebook, she wrote, "During this time I had some interesting holidays. A friend and I had a trip in Germany, seeing Heidelberg and going on the Rhine. This was the year in which the Germans walked into the Rhineland and Hitler was getting into power. Police and military hastened to be the first to salute each other in the street, starting 100 yards off to be in time. They looked absurd. Absurd they may have looked, but war in Spain had begun in earnest. And in July 1936, while Hitler was at Bayreuth for the Wagner Festival, a messenger came with a letter from General Franco asking for his help in the Spanish Civil War. Ignoring the advice of his government not to get involved, Hitler eventually sent his crack Condor Legion of Junkers and Heinkel bombers and Heinkel fighters to carpet bomb, under Franco's orders, and when the streets were seething with people, the defenseless market town of Guernica, the ancient capital of the Basques. Those who tried to escape to the fields were hunted from the air by the Heinkel fighters and machine-gunned. It was April the 26th, 1937. We know Picasso's great painting, begun a few days later on his hearing the news. What Hitler wanted was to see how civilians and how his own pilots would react to carpet bombing, what he was later to call Coventrieren, to annihilate or raze a city to the ground, a word coined after his destruction of our Coventry and its cathedral. In this dress rehearsal of Guernica, he found he need not have worried. Hitler could now make this his new weapon for his coming war. On October, the same year, 1937, I was born at Bishopthorpe, in the vicarage, under the protecting shade of the Archbishop of York's palace. My father was vicar of Bishopthorpe, population 900. But more important in retrospect, also personal chaplain to the Archbishop, a man he had long admired, William Temple. He was to remain William Temple's personal chaplain until the end of Temple's life. Part of the attraction of this young priest, perhaps, was his growing family. The Temples had no children. So, William became godfather to my brother, Andrew, and Mrs. Temple, Frances, was my godmother, hence my name. He christened me on St. Stephen's Day, 1937, from his wife's arms. Temple's thinking greatly influenced my parents, both of whom, like Temple, had read greats at Oxford. On Temple's death, in October 1944, my father compiled a selection from the Archbishop's writings, published as daily readings from William Temple. William, now Archbishop of Canterbury, had been for some years the moral voice of Britain. His social concern, for instance, led him to being one of the urgent moving spirits, calling for what became, after his death, our National Health Service. As Britain prevaricated in the face of coming war, it was he whose clarity of moral thought complemented Churchill's fierce, if lonely, political clear-sightedness. The Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned from Munich, his third personal meeting with Hitler, and told the House of Commons he had brought back with him peace in our time, and that it was peace with honour. He now asked for cordial relations between this country and Germany. The House was ecstatic, hailed him as the greatest leader and peacemaker. One lonely figure stood up. Churchill replied, "The Prime Minister desires to see cordial relations between this country and Germany. There is no difficulty at all in having cordial relations between the peoples. Our hearts go out to them, but they have no power. There can never be friendship between the British democracy and the Nazi power. That power which spurns Christian ethics, which cheers its onward course by a barbarous paganism, which vaunts the spirit of aggression and conquest, which derives strength and perverted pleasure from persecution, and uses, as we have seen, with pitiless brutality, the threat of murderous force. That power can never be the trusted friend of the British democracy." It was a very brave speech. William Temple's voice was equally clear in the moral sphere. A fight for good against evil, broadly speaking, I think it is. I've said so repeatedly in the clearest language I know. But, of course, the main concern of the Church must be with the quality of the people carrying on the fight. Therefore, one cannot say only that it is a fight of good against evil, but also that we have to make ourselves more fit to serve the good cause. Once war came, many asked how it could be reconciled with the sixth commandment. Temple wrote from Lambeth Palace, "There is no record that our Lord ever said, 'Thou shalt not kill.'" The Mosaic sixth commandment is more accurately represented by the prayer book than the Bible. For the word in Hebrew does not refer to killing of any kind, but definitely to murder. That is to say, killing for personal advantage or the satisfaction of personal passion. I am quite sure that it is our duty at present to fight the war through and win it, and if we are to fight, then of course we must do so effectively. But it is quite possible to fight without malice, and indeed the malice is much more likely to be found among folk at home than in the fighting forces. Elsewhere he wrote, "To fight is, at best, the less of evils." It was with this clear moral guidance that my father, Hugh, took up his new post as Vicar of Epsom in December 1938. His first ambition was to transform the St. Martin's Parish magazine. And in January, number 1, he only came in December, January, number 1, vol 1, new issue, was published in a fresh format. From January 1939 till October 1950, he wrote a monthly vicar's letter to his parishioners to introduce the magazine, 143 of them, and they chronicle, month by month, what it was like to live through those terrible years. It is an impressive archive, a narrative of moral guidance through the darkness that for nearly 6 years seemed to have no end in sight. It shows a faith tried in the fires and unblinking leadership. Epsom Parish Magazine, February 1940, from the Vicar. My dear friends, it is probable that for many of us these coming months will strain our Christian loyalty to the breaking point. Self-pity, bitter hatred against fellow Christians, distrust of the love of God, and even doubt as to whether the Christian values of freedom and humanity are worth suffering for, may each in turn corrode our souls. God is calling us to years of special heroism. Lent this year must be observed by us all as no Lent has ever been before. Here are the questions to which we must try to find answers this Lent. A. What power is there in my life which would help me successfully to face the loss of my family? B. What inner resources have I to offset the hopelessness that comes to some when business crashes? C. If I feel convinced that it is God's will for me to take a share in the destruction of my fellow men, how can I do this and yet keep hatred and bitterness out of my heart all the time? That was February. June 1940. My dear friends, I want to be very practical in my letter this month, as there seems no doubt now that before I write my next letter to you, we may have faced air raids. There are two ways of facing them, as Christians and as pagans. 1. A Christian is one who believes that the unseen things of the Spirit are more important than the material things we see and handle every day. Bombs are only able to destroy these more or less unimportant material things, like buildings, roads, human bodies. I say more or less because in ordinary times, material things, just because of their beauty and their usefulness, are tremendously worth caring for and valuing. But we are not living in ordinary times. when at grips with the spirit of evil on such a vast scale. Bombs can't destroy any of the really important things like hope, courage, service of other people worse off than ourselves, faith, the human soul. Our job, therefore, is to go on building up other people's faith, hope, and courage, no matter to what extent destruction of material things is going on around us. 6. 3 things may happen to us. We may escape unscathed, in which case we shall throw ourselves into the task of helping others, or we may suffer physically through being wounded, in which case we will remember that Christ passed the same way before his way to victory on the cross, and we but share his sufferings with the knowledge that our strength is made perfect in weakness. Or we may be killed, in which case there need be nothing but the uttermost confidence and fearlessness, if we've taken the trouble to be prepared by our daily prayers, our weekly Holy Communion, and our unselfishness all along the line. 7. There's one other possibility. We may lose one or more of our relations. If this happens, fortify yourself by the conviction that death cannot break the bonds of love if this love has been expressed in some close connection with Christ. 8. Do not mix up physical fear with moral fear. Physical fear, the sort, for instance, that makes our knees go wobbly and insides go queer, is best dealt with by rationally thinking through what it is that we're frightened of and realizing why we need not be because of what I've just said in paragraphs 6 and 7 above. 9. Moral fear is something to be ashamed of. It is the sort that stops caring whether the cause of justice is worth suffering for, or whether the things of the spirit are really more important than the material things which bombs destroy, and which cloaks itself in a venomous hatred of our enemies. 10. There need be no alarm if the siren goes off when we're in church, since our plans are made. If it is a Holy Communion service, we shall take no notice but carry on. Obviously, there is no better place to be in, whether for life or death, than the realized presence of Jesus. Those whose emergency duties call them at once may leave the church without disturbing others. Sit in the middle of the church, and the risk of hurt from the falling glass will be negligible. After the service, wait in the church until the priest has decided if it's safe to cross over to the crypt to church house. 12. Every worshipper must bring his or her gas mask to all church services. Children will be sent home from Sunday school if they come without their mask, or after an airway warning has been given. Ample shelter accommodation has been provided for all of them. If you parents come along, you only take up space in the shelter which the children ought to have. The teachers will keep them happy, so don't worry. Stay at home. If you see the flag flying, this means emergency arrangements are in force. Now, think of Peter on the water and Jesus saying, "Why are ye fearful, O ye of little faith?" And throw yourselves again into the business of being a real Christian in every way. Yours sincerely, Hugh Warner. Emergency arrangements included the War Office directive that church bells throughout the land should be silent. If they rang, that announced the German parachutists had landed, and most people took this to mean the invasion would have begun. Over at West Grinstead, just 28 miles away, Tom Locke, the only home guard bell ringer to live conveniently close to St. George's Church, was told to ring only after he'd received a written order delivered by dispatch rider. It was not a task he relished. The bells at St. George's are positioned on the ground floor, and a German sniper would easily have been able to pick him off through a window. How long should he ring? Oh, just give it a good whacking, his superior told him. Now, church bell ringing is not just tugging on a rope. It is a skill. To start with, each bell must be set, its mouth upwards. This in itself is hard work. My eldest brother, David, had tried, with my father standing by him, pulling a bell rope. It came down, slipped through his finger and flung him over backwards. He was not fazed, as my Aunt Rabine wrote in her notebook about the effect of the continuous night bombing on us children. David was too busy to be frightened. He was always collecting gas masks, shepherding the other boys, generally being useful. But Andrew was the only one who wondered what would happen if we lost the war. So I think he worried quite a bit. For Michaelmas term 1940, David was to leave us for his first boarding school, the prep school at Amberley near Stroud, Gloucestershire, called St George's. From then until July 44, except in the holidays, Andrew was the senior brother at home. In that month, my father's vicar's letter in the parish magazine speaks of our newly disturbed nights as the V1 rockets, Hitler's secret weapon, and doodlebugs, as we called them, hit Epsom. Next month's August 1944 letter opens. In the midst of life we are in death. Strange how sentences like that suddenly come to mean something very true. In these days, right up against it. None of us but has to come to terms with it in one way or another. They say to look at a thing you fear straight in the face is to be no longer afraid of it. Let's try. On June the 27th, the V1 had fallen on the railway London terminus we all used, Victoria Station, killing 14 travellers and maiming many others. One result of that was that David did not come home in July, but spent the summer holidays in Wales with relatives. Andrew was sent to be with him. And from there, in September 1944, he joined David at St George's Prep School in relative safety, playing Balthazar's attendant, while his elder brother David plays Caspar in the school's nativity play. This meant that from July 44 until late spring 45, a V2 rocket fell on London's Smithfield Market on the 8th of March, killing 110 people, only 8 weeks before the German war ended on the 8th of May 45. During the last year of the war, throughout that culmination of slaughter, I was the senior brother living at Epsom Vicarage. With Martin, later to become the academic philosopher, next, and then our joy, our first sister, Megan, who had been born on the 4th of September 1943, the year of the Sandhurst Road School massacre. This time, the new baby did not arrive between the alert and the all clear of the sirens, as with Martin, but while Andrew and I were sitting in our apple tree. However, as Megan was coming into the world in the Warple Road Vicarage, Andrew fell out of the apple tree and broke his arm. Will you publicly confirm, Andrew, that I did not push you? The inconvenience of this timing to my poor parents is best left to your imagination. For the first 2 years of her life, Megan slept with my mother's sister in a cupboard under the stairs. As a baby in a metal cradle shaped like half a walnut shell, with bulletproof transparency over the face section. It came complete with oxygen pump in case of gas attack. As my mother said ruefully, when the flame-tailed roar and rattle of a doodlebug passing over us began to hum off to destruction, while she and I bathed the baby by candlelight. Everyone expects one war in a generation, but 2 is really too much. but daily life had to go on. In 1944, Rabin's notebook tells us, Epsom was now a more dangerous town, with V-bombs about day and night. Shopping one day, I saw one of our pilots gently edge one of these nuisances with his left wing to fall onto an open space and then come back waggling his wings at the shopping queues, and we all waved. She goes on, during the last year of the V-bombs, my sister and the 3 boys, David was away at boarding school, slept in the Morrison shelter in the dining room. It took up the whole room in the smaller house into which we had moved. The new baby, Megan, and I slept under the stairs in the broom cupboard. During June and July 1944, Andrew and Martin slept with their heads at one end, while my mother and I slept at the other. We all had to keep our feet still. From late July, when Andrew went to be with David in Wales, my mother had one end to herself, albeit with 4 feet continuously poking her, in the table cage in which we spent our nights and at which we ate during the day. My father slept at the end of the garden in the damaged and unsafe Anderson shelter. These half-underground, bent corrugated iron-roofed huts were surprisingly effective, if damp and cold. They cost £7 each, unless your annual income was under £350, in which case they came free. Ever ready with fresh ideas? He wrote in his vicar's letter of October 1940, in order to allow more room in a small shelter, have you tried a hammock? You can sling it across a normal Anderson shelter by piercing the sides of the shelter from the metal hooks and fixing a small metal plate on the outside before screwing the nut back on. Has anyone tried heating a shelter with a candle placed in a slightly raised flower pot, with another flower pot inverted over the top? The inverted pot soon gets so warm that it generates a flow of hot air round about. He slept out there, so his biographer put it, so he could dash off to the scene of action even before the sirens had ceased their alarm. He sensed uncannily where a bomb was going to fall, and was usually on the spot before either doctor, air raid wardens, or rescue squad. From this tree-shaded Anderson shelter, he would visit the parishioners. Can't we think of some plan of providing simple refreshments for those who have to sit for 6 hours or so in the public shelters? I have already found how welcome even one biscuit or a packet of potato crisps is to people caught away from home and bed like this. Would you like to help me provide something like this, especially for the children and mothers with small babies? As I am patrolling the parish continually during all raids, I could take a snack satchel round with me to the public shelters. His parishioners responded, and their church attendance was impressive. In August 1940, he writes, on every hand I sense a growing feeling of high courage and spiritual renewal. It isn't only that every Sunday our church is packed twice over with 1,000 people a time, but every day brings some new evidence of generous kindness and good humour. 2 years later, he writes, October 42, who would have guessed that the day of prayer last month was to have been such an overpowering experience? A church packed to overflowing twice in 2 hours, and after that, 300 at the communion service, and great services in other churches round the town. There was one group of non-Christians for whom he had a passionate mission. In June 1941, he writes, many Jewish refugees have come lately into our midst, and I am sure we would be eager to do all we can to help them after the persecutions they have been through. I was glad, therefore, to be able to offer the use of part of our church house on Friday evenings and Saturday mornings, the Sabbath, to a delegation of Jews who came to ask me if I could help them find premises for the conduct of their services. Next year, he's holding a special service, several, for the Jews in Germany and countries occupied by the enemy. By 1943, he's crying out in big, bold type in the parish magazine, "Is it nothing to you?" An urgent appeal to all Christians in Epsom. Mass shootings, mass poison gassings, mass electrocution, transportation in cattle trucks with lime and chlorine, 150 people to a truck, pregnant mothers, babies, children, the sick, the very old. There is no discrimination. They are Jews. That's enough. In Nazi-occupied Europe, there were at the beginning of the war 6 million Jews. Already, between 1 and 2 million have been murdered deliberately by the Nazis. This policy is now being speeded up and is reaching its climax. Can nothing be done for those who are left? Send a postcard immediately to the following: Sir Archibald Sotheby, the House of Commons, the Home Secretary, Whitehall, SW1, the Foreign Secretary, Whitehall, SW1, urging two things, namely, 1, that our own regulations for the admission of refugees should be relaxed, 2, that the boldest possible measures of rescue should be adopted. Then, next month, April 43, when the evils against which we are fighting rear their ugly heads in our own midst, it is the duty of every Christian to go for them and kill them. Are we in England completely untainted by the same poison of anti-Semitism? The latest example I've come across has been the accusation that the shelter disaster in London was due to the Jews. It is wicked not to get hold of the real facts. As a greater awareness of what the Nazis had been doing in the concentration camps grew, incredulity turned to anger, desire for punishment, and revenge. Did not the German V1 and V2 rockets mean Vergeltungswaffe, or revenge weapon? As Quentin Reynolds, the American war reporter, wrote of the British mood at this time, they were through taking it. They wanted to give it. In the magazine, as early as October 1941, my father asks, are we beginning to do what 2 years ago we promised ourselves we would never do? In those days, we could hold our heads high in the midst of bombs and anxiety because our cause was untarnished by the blind seeking for revenge. Churchill, having asked to see a film showing the bombing of London, German towns, suddenly, according to the diary of Australia's representative on our war cabinet, Richard Casey, Churchill suddenly sat bolt upright and said to me, "Are we beasts? Are we taking this too far?" Though at the request of the Russians, Churchill had agreed with the American chiefs of staff to deflect some of our bomber force to attack the German lines of communication in the Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig area, and had given Air Marshal Harris a free hand, when he heard of the obliteration of Dresden, Churchill did his best to restrict area bombing. Minute to Chief of Air Staff Sir Charles Portal and Chiefs of Staff Committee, 28th of March, 1945. It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of the bombing of German cities, simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise, we shall come into a control of an utterly ruined land. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. But the bombing campaign that was finally to escalate into Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the war to an end, had spun beyond the control even of Churchill. In August 1944, a Vergeltungswaffe rocket nearly destroyed our Warple Road vicarage. And once again, all the windows were blasted. This was a near miss too close. My grandmother, living with us, dying of cancer, sent one of us children downstairs with a message to our mother to tell the boys in the street outside to stop revving up their motorbikes. It is very inconsiderate of them to make such a noise. Alas, it was more than motorbikes. Though she was right, it was very inconsiderate. So we decamped to her home, her house, in Hove, Sussex, on the south coast. Even to us children, it seemed an odd choice of refuge, as it was so much nearer to the enemy. When in early November we returned, I had missed 23 days of Epsom schooling. Now, in retrospect, I can see my mother wanted to sort out some of her mother's possessions and papers before she died. Grandmother's death came on the 30th of September. With that, our Aunt Rabine, who had been nursing her, came to Hove, leaving my father on his own in the windy vicarage, carrying on his desolate tasks. And so it was while he was alone that on the 26th of October, the news came to him of the death of his beloved Archbishop Temple. My mother later wrote, "Immediately he took a train to Westgate to be of what help he could to Mrs. Temple and to look his last on the serene and ever youthful face of his dear Arch." In addition to two brothers in the Navy, my father had two sisters who, at a distance, were a support. The elder, my Aunt Rosalie, was a lieutenant colonel in the Queen Alexandra's Royal Army Nursing Corps. She was sent to a serious war zone to replace the matron of Mogadishu Hospital, who had just been murdered. After that posting, Rosalie was matron of Malta's military hospital, where Gunner Andrew Warner, my brother, now Canon Warner, Gunner Andrew Warner, while on active service, visited our aunt on the island, touching down in a noisy York troop carrier on his way to the Suez Canal. Lieutenant Colonel Warner and Gunner Warner met on the tarmac. To his relief, he did not have to salute, as she was in civilian clothes. Finally, Rosalie was promoted to be matron of QA Military Hospital, Millbank, London. She came through the war unscathed. Her younger sister, our Aunt Maud, nearly did not. As a first officer, she was, with others, entrusted with censoring letters from our troops prior to D-Day, 6th of June 1944. It was vital that Hitler should continue to be deceived and expect the main invasion course of the Allies to land and attack at Pas-de-Calais. It is, after all, the shortest sea route between England and France. Censorship and deception succeeded. To the relief of the Allies, Hitler continued to keep his 15th Army defending Pas-de-Calais in empty anticipation for 20 days after the Normandy landings had been established. Maud sat in our high-backed chair, overlooking the sea at Dover, making sure soldiers' handwritten letters home contained no indication of troop movements. One day, after a long stint, she left the room for a few minutes. During those minutes, an exploding bomb threw a vicious piece of shrapnel through the window, knocking over her chair. She kept the shard and gave it to me. "Be careful it does not cut your fingers. It's outside." So shrapnel from Dover on the eve of D-Day arrives in Cambridge 67 years later. It is a popular myth that Cambridge did not suffer in the Blitz. But if you visit me in my college rooms in St. Catharine's, you can still read, painted on the door frame of my staircase, C staircase, opposite the list of names, directions to the college's air raid shelter. According to Jesus College's 41st annual report, quoted in the Cambridge Alumni magazine, number 60 of Easter 2010. There were 424 air raid alerts at Cambridge during the war, during which the enemy dropped 118 high-explosive bombs, 3 oil bombs, and about 1,000 incendiaries, and 29 people were killed. The Round Church, the Union Society, houses in Jesus Lane were all hit in July 1942. We can add many more incidents. That at Dornier, 217, bomber was shot down, landing in Warren Road, off Milton Road, though the newspapers were made to say only that it had come down on some allotments in the country. You can see the photographs of it in the scrapbook, compiled by Ian and Brown Gerard and their father before him, that they have lent for display today here, outside, and for which we thank them. There's a photograph. Lady Chadwick kept a meticulous diary which tells of many raids and events that are otherwise unrecorded or were hushed up. A brief sample. 18th of June 1940, 100 planes came over East Coast and 7 were shot down. 1 bomber dropped a bomb on Mill Road and 7 people were killed. He was shot down by a Spitfire. 11th of October 1940, Cums, Cambridge University Music Society, Cums sang Stanford's Songs of the Fleet, with Henry accompanying. Siren in the middle, but we took no notice. 29th of October to 28th of November, she lists all the dates. Sirens due to planes passing over Cambridge to Coventry. Sirens slept in the corridor of her college all night. 15th of January 1941, incendiary bombs dropped on Cambridge Perse Boys' School. 7th of March 1941, Boris Ord conducted for the last time before going to Air Force. Boris was my musical mentor. He had been a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps in the First World War, during which time he had been twice wounded, the second time seriously. He rejoined the RAF as flight lieutenant 1941 until 1946, participating in the Normandy landings and ensuing campaign and so on. Boris Ord is remembered today as a supreme choir trainer of his time. On his demobilisation in 1946, he returned to King's, building up and sustaining the choir until his final illness in 1958. I today bow to the memory of a patron and a brave veteran pilot of 2 world wars. I have spoken of my maiden aunts. There was a shortage of potential as well as actual husbands after the First World War, of my mother's sister, Rabine, and of my father's sisters, Rosalie and Maud. These were important role models, but an even more influential example to us was our unflinching, loving mother. She wrote a weekly letter to each of her 6 children every week of her life until she was nearly 90. What strain did the Blitz impose on even a happy marriage? This afternoon you will hear her speak for the first time on this. But before that, an introductory digression. The first volume of my collected poems was published by our loyal publisher, Colin Smythe, in 1985. My poetry is classical, so I was fortunate in having as my proofreader A.H. Buck from Catford. Bucky, my old classics master from Christ's Hospital, where he had been as a boy as well as a master, but at this time in retirement, a proofreader for Oxford University Press. Bucky had been called up at the close of World War I and received a commission. He discovered on DMob that he could not take up his classics scholarship at St John's College, Oxford, until October 1919, as Oxford was overfull of war survivors. So, with a school friend fellow officer, he therefore returned to Christ's Hospital to finish his time as a schoolboy. Now, we must remember, of course, the call-up was on your 18th birthday. One master asked them if they would mind sitting at the back during lessons, as having veteran commissioned officers from France in his front row as he expounded Caesar's Gallic War, he found a bit unnerving. In 1985, Bucky sent back my corrected proofs with the words, "I've done my best with all your poems except the one written in German, a language I detest and I refuse to read." Against that, I want to place on record that over the years, I've had a number of German doctorate students teaching for me, and I have found them among the finest men you could hope to know. Evil breeds. It's never static, as the war showed. But there is another truth that age brings. It is that over a longer time period, goodness can too, though only at the cost of cutting out the cancer. These grandchildren and great-grandchildren, young Germans, are to me one of the miracles of history. And proof that, with the birth of new innocence, the innate potential for goodness and compassion in human beings finally triumphs. To return from this digression, on the publication of Collected Poems 1960 to 84, my mother wrote me a letter enclosing some poems she had written over the years about which we knew nothing. One I shall read you. Her letter introduces it with these words: "I came across the enclosed poem I wrote years ago in Epsom when wartime conditions, babies, etc. had got me down." Wife to husband. "I vexed you, dear, I know, this morning. I wept, you could not fathom why. You felt aggrieved, exasperated. I don't look pretty when I cry. Good Lord, you thought, these tears, these women. You didn't say so, no, that's true. Control's an admirable virtue. I wish it were consoling too. Years passed in love's strong arms enfolded. I should have sobbed each foolish thing, and we'd have kissed and laughed together till all the pinpricks ceased to sting. But there's no time these days for courting. Minds jaded, bodies tired, nerves frayed, oppress fond hearts, and youth's clear vision by wedded care is overlaid. Deep down, you dear old moralizer, you say, our love is just as big. I know, but oh, how deep it's buried, and I am far too tired to dig. It's hid neath duties, cares, engagements, scant leisure, overburdened time, bills, sickness, worries, screaming babies, and wives that cry at breakfast time. Oh, come, dear, only one wife, surely. Suppose you had a whole harem. There, now you're laughing. Oh, thank heaven, I thought that I was going to scream. Be tired, be cross, but don't be solemn. A joke dispels so many a fret. Give me one kiss, warm, gay, forgiving, and I'll not cry again. Just yet. Daddy was much touched by it and gave me a good hug. And they were to give us yet another baby when hostilities finally ceased. Alison, our peace baby, here today with her husband. My late parents now have many grandchildren, and 3 of their great-grandchildren are present. Marianne, Lena, and with my daughter, mother and father, Alice. All of them children of the peace, announced in a world broadcast, 8th of the May, 1945, unconditional surrender. Churchill, Spain. Yesterday morning, 2:41 a.m. at headquarters, General Joddle, the representative of the High German Command, and General Admiral Dönitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the act of unconditional surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe. The German war is therefore at an end. Finally, almost the whole world was combined against the evildoers who are now prostrate before us. Our gratitude to our splendid allies goes forth from all our hearts. And then Churchill said to Parliament, I recollect well at the end of the last war, more than a quarter of a century ago, that the House, when it had heard the long list of surrender terms, did not feel inclined for debate or business, but desired to offer thanks to Almighty God, to the great power which seems to shape and design the fortunes of nations and the destinies of man. And I therefore beg, Sir, with your permission, the identical motion which was moved in former times, that this House do now attend the Church of St. Margaret, Westminster, to give humble and reverent thanks to Almighty God for our deliverance. At that moment, it seemed the overwhelming mechanisms of war, with all their horrors, had been defeated by three strengths. All indeed we could offer, and which were offered throughout those 6 years of what we understatedly called the duration. Offered with humour, with endurance, and through grief, in that supreme quality, in combatant and civilian alike, personal courage. The three weapons that had proved unbreakable were the sustaining love generated within family life and throughout widespread outgoing and unselfish good neighbourliness, the idealistic faith embodied by our universally loved spiritual leader, William Temple, and in our own case, by his young and devoted chaplain, and the hope, in our darkest agony, massacres, defeat, against all reason, ignited, cherished, and finally triumphant, breathed on us through the wireless by Winston Churchill. I shall close with words delivered by a university lecturer over 2,300 years ago, also spoken some 70 years after a major war. By Aristotle, whose tutor, Plato, had as a child lived through the closing years of the Peloponnesian War, that struggle between the oligarchs of Sparta and the birthplace of democracy, and had known the fall of his city, Athens. And we ought not to listen to those who counsel us, O man, think as man should, or O mortal, remember your mortality. Rather ought we, so far as in us lies, to put on immortality and to leave nothing unattempted in the effort to live in conformity with the highest thing in us. Small in bulk it may be, but in power and preciousness it transcends all the rest.
Questions, but I would like to ask you to wait until you receive the microphone before you ask your question so everybody can hear. So are there any questions from the audience for Francis?
Francis, you've told us about your father's delight at the crowds flocking to his church and the other Epsom churches during the time of the Blitz and just afterwards. Did he stay in Epsom after the war? And if so, What happened to his ministry then? That's to say, did victory breed instant spiritual apathy?
He became secretary, was it, of the moral... Help me here.
Education Secretary of the Church of England Moral Welfare Council.
So he moved on from Epsom. But so I don't know what happened after that. Thank you, Roger.
Francis, I grew up in East London, and so we were sort of at the end of your run, in a sense. And my twin brother and I had a father who was a detective sergeant in the police, in the Metropolitan Police. And he served in Hackney Police Station, a very large Victorian building with huge windows. And just before he died, about 10 years ago, I asked him where they'd sheltered during the Blitz. And he answered that they had no shelter and explained that, I naively thought that criminal activity didn't go on during the Blitz, but he explained that they needed to be on duty because of looters. And this apparently was rife. So I think that we need to understand that while we might be all in this together, as we are told today, and we were certainly told that during the war, I think it was surprising just how many people felt otherwise.
You've just heard a little bit of history that I didn't know about. Thank you for contributing that very much indeed. These personal details are so important now because we are the last generation that bear witness. After us, it'll be just like Napoleon. Thank you.
Well, and we lived in a house about 2 miles from the docks, and the street opposite us was obliterated by a landmine. 15 people were killed. So our house was completely decimated. We had to get out. And our house, there was no roof, no walls. And when my father came back to the house, all the furniture had been moved into the front, by the front door. There were all sorts of artifacts, our toys and what have you, all ready to be removed by the good old British Londoner who was going to take them away. So, things weren't perfect during the war, I can assure you. But like you, we lived in an air raid shelter for pretty well all the time. I was a baby in a hammock in an air raid shelter, so I knew all about that. Well, I didn't know about it, but I heard about it. So it's...
Thank you, that's a good corrective. I wasn't trying to make it idealised.
No.
But you're quite right.
Francis, what struck me with having my own children is that you must have grown up in fear till you were about 8, 9 years old. And I'm just interested to know how you felt in the year or two after the war, if you just kind of believed that it would come back again, or did you have that relief it will never happen again?
We thought it would go on. Outside, you'll find that I've passed the RAF exam to become a Spitfire pilot when I grow up. And we just thought, this was life. It's going to be the Russians next. And we never thought to be 50, 60, 70 years of peace. No, the assumption was this, read Orwell's 1984, which is based, he puts it in 1984, but actually it's 1941. What he's describing is all 1941. We just thought these land masses with people on were always fighting. No, we just assumed that it would go on and on. And we adjusted.
Francis, you mentioned the effect of Churchill's broadcasts and also of William Temple's moral teaching. A third figure who's being much written about now in terms of the effects of his broadcasts during the war, and who also I think you were a student of and a friend of, was C.S. Lewis. Were you, or perhaps was your father, sort of aware of the extent to which the broadcasts he made during the war and the talks he gave to airmen and the things that eventually became mere Christianity, did those have an influence? Did your father ever write about those at all, or,
yes,
or himself make use of them in Epsom?
Yes, he had a huge influence on them, and that's why I was so touched when I became his pupil, because I'd heard about him all through the war. Yes, he had a profound and deep influence.
Thank you. Well, tea awaits us, so I think we should draw the questions to a close, and then conversation can continue over tea. But obviously, I would like to thank you, Francis, for a hugely stimulating lecture. We got off to a very good start with our inaugural Madingley lecture in early January, and it's very clear that we're continuing the tradition today. And as a small token of our thanks, I would like to present you, Francis, with a small gift which gives the history of the hall and the gardens and the Prince of Wales. Thank you very much.
Very much indeed.
Thank you.